The first ball of the season at Almack's had been underway for nearly an hour when Cecily Wren arrived in a gown of pale muslin that had been turned at the seams and pressed twice that morning. The fabric held. The mending did not show unless one stood close, and no one at Almack's intended to stand close to a girl whose father had died 14 months ago and left behind nothing save 2,000 pounds of debt, and a name that no longer carried weight in any room that mattered. She entered on the arm of her aunt, Lady Brixton, who had taken her in not from love nor from obligation, precisely, but from a sense of public duty she mentioned at every opportunity. The room was crowded with candles and diamonds and voices pitched to carry, and Cecily moved through it the way water moves past a stone too small to notice, disturbing nothing, noticed by no one she wished to be noticed by. The Dowager Duchess of Halford saw her first. Lady Ashworth stood beside the pillar nearest the musicians, her posture a masterwork of carved authority, her gloved hand resting on the ivory head of her cane. She noted the girl in the pale gown, noted the mended seam at the left shoulder where the fabric puckered faintly under the light, and turned to Miss Georgiana Palliser, who stood beside her in cream silk and pearls, worth more than anything Cecily had ever touched. "The Wren girl," Lady Ashworth said, and her voice carried the particular warmth she reserved for people she intended to forget. "Still in last season's muslin. One does wonder what Lady Brixton was thinking, bringing her here dressed like a governess." Georgiana smiled and said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. Across the room, Henry Ashworth, the Duke of Halford, stood at the edge of the dance floor with a glass of claret he had not touched. He was 31 years old, tall, dark-haired, and possessed of a stillness that made people lower their voices when they approached him. He had arrived late, spoken to no one he did not have to, and his right hand rested at the pocket of his waistcoat, where something small and flat pressed against the silk lining. He had not danced. He did not intend to dance. His gaze moved across the ballroom without settling until it found the girl in the pale gown near the far wall, the one whose mended shoulder caught the candlelight wrong, and then it stopped. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to Lord Carteret beside him and said, in a voice as level as a ruled line, "That gown has been turned twice. Someone ought to have seen to it." He said it quietly. He said it to no one who would repeat it. He did not know that Cecily Wren had moved 2 steps closer to the refreshment table in the last half-minute, and that the particular acoustics of Almack's eastern wall carried a low voice, farther than a shout. She heard him. Her fingers curled inward at her sides, the way they always did when she wanted a pencil, and did not have one. Her face did not change. Her breathing did not change. She turned her back to the refreshment table and looked at the candles reflected in the polished floor, and let the heat in her face do what it would do where no one could see it. The Duke of Halford thought her gown was worth remarking on. The Duke of Halford had looked at her shoulder and seen the mending, and found it notable enough to comment upon to his companion, and that was all she needed to know about the Duke of Halford. If you have ever stood in a room full of people who could afford to be there and known, with a certainty that sits in the body like a stone, that you could not, you already know what Cecily felt in that moment. If you have not, stay. You are about to. What Cecily did not know, could not have known, was that the Duke of Halford's remark had not been about the gown at all. It had been about the fact that someone in this girl's life had failed her, and that failure was visible in a public room, and that the particular quality of her stillness as she stood among the season's diamonds in her twice-turned muslin had landed in a place inside his chest that he had kept locked for 7 years. His hand pressed harder against the waistcoat pocket. Inside it, a violet, dried and brown and nearly weightless, pressed back. She left the ball at 10:30, before the supper dance, while the room was still full and loud. Lady Brixton did not notice for 20 minutes. The next morning, Cecily sat at the small writing desk in the room Lady Brixton had given her on the 3rd floor of the house on Half Moon Street. The room was narrow and cold and faced the mews, and the desk was missing a drawer pull, and the chair was borrowed from the servants' hall. She did not mind the room. She minded the dependents. She minded the particular quality of Lady Brixton's generosity, which arrived each morning at breakfast in the form of a small recitation of sacrifice. This morning it had been the cost of candles. Yesterday it had been the cost of coal. The morning before, the cost of a second egg, which Lady Brixton's housekeeper had not anticipated when planning the week's provisions. Cecily ate her single egg and said nothing, and went upstairs to her desk and opened her leather case. The one thing of her father's she had been permitted to keep because no one had wanted it. Inside were pencils, graphite sticks in 3 grades of hardness, wrapped in paper, a small knife for sharpening, a worn eraser, and a sheaf of paper, the last of her father's botanical stock, heavy and cream-colored and meant for the kind of careful observation that required a steady hand and a patient eye. Her father had been a naturalist, not a famous one, not a published one in the end. He had spent 30 years cataloging the wildflowers of the Hampshire Downs, sketching them with a precision that lived somewhere between science and devotion, labeling each one in his careful hand. He had died in a rented room in Winchester, with his botanical folios stacked around him like a paper fortress, and the creditors had taken the folios and the books and the pressed specimens and the watercolor box and everything else that could be sold. They had not wanted the pencils. They had not wanted the blank paper. Cecily had wanted nothing else. She drew for 2 hours that morning, working from memory on a study of wild violets she had seen in the hedgerow near her father's cottage the spring before he died. The violets had been small and dark-petaled, the particular shade of purple that looks almost black when the light is low, and she rendered each one with the same patient precision her father had taught her. The veins of the petals, the curve of the stem, the way the leaves cupped inward slightly at the edges, as if protecting something they were not ready to release. She drew until the light through the narrow window shifted, and the shadows on the page told her the morning was gone, and she set the finished sketch on top of the leather case and flexed her cramped fingers and thought of nothing, which was the closest she came to peace. 3 days later, she took her pencils and her last sheets of paper to the public gardens at the center of the square. Lady Brixton had gone to pay calls and would not return until 4. The house was empty except for the servants, who did not look at her, and the silence in her narrow room had begun to press against her, like a hand on her chest. She needed air. She needed something to draw that was alive and present, and not a memory. She found a bench at the far end of the garden, near the iron railing where the elm trees threw their shade, and she sat and opened her case and began to sketch the violets growing in the bed beside her. These were paler than the Hampshire ones, their petals veined with white, and she worked slowly, moving her pencil in the short, careful strokes that built each petal from nothing into something that held the light. She did not hear the gate open. She did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path. She did not know that anyone was watching her until a shadow crossed her page, and she looked up and saw the Duke of Halford standing 6 feet away, his hand arrested at his side, his face entirely still. He had been walking. He lived in the square. He had come through the garden gate as he did each morning, and he had seen a woman on the bench with her head bent over a page, and he had intended to pass without stopping. He had intended to do many things he did not do. He stopped because she was drawing violets. He stopped because the violets on her page were rendered with a precision that made his breath catch in his throat. And the precision was not cold, not mechanical, not the work of someone copying a plate from a book. It was the work of someone who had looked at a violet, truly looked at it, and seen the particular way a living thing holds itself together. And Henry Ashworth, the Duke of Halford, had not seen that kind of seeing in 7 years. Not since his sister Eleanor had knelt in the garden at Halford and pressed a violet between the pages of her primer and held it up to him and said, "Look, Henry, look how it keeps its color, even when it is dead." Eleanor had been 12 years old. She had died of fever that winter, while Henry was at Eton, while the roads were impassable, while he was reading Virgil in a cold dormitory, and did not know until the letter came 3 days after she was buried. The violet in his waistcoat pocket had been the last one she pressed. He stood 6 feet from the bench and watched Cecily Wren draw and did not speak, and did not move, and did not know that his face, which the tune considered unreadable, had changed. His jaw, which was always set, had loosened. His eyes, which were always guarded, had gone soft at the edges in a way that would have astonished every person who had ever called him cold. Cecily looked up. She saw a tall man in a dark coat staring at her sketch with an expression she could not decipher. She recognized him. Her stomach tightened. She closed her leather case and stood and gathered her pencils and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to the man who had remarked upon her gown in a public room, and she walked past him toward the garden gate with her case pressed against her ribs. "You dropped something," he said. She turned. A single sheet of paper lay on the bench where she had been sitting, the violet sketch, its edges lifting faintly in the breeze. "Take it with you," he said, and his voice was low and level and carried no warmth she could identify. "The wind will have it." She hesitated. For a single breath, standing 3 feet from him with the afternoon light falling across the path between them, she was aware of his height and his stillness and the particular way he held his hands at his sides, as though preventing them from doing something they wanted to do. Her pulse moved in her throat. She did not understand why. She walked back and took the sketch from the bench and did not look at him, and left. She did not know that after she left, the Duke of Halford sat on the bench where she had been sitting, and that his hand went to his waistcoat pocket, and that he held the pressed violet between his thumb and forefinger for a long time, and that the expression on his face, had anyone been present to see it, was not mockery at all. The following week brought the Duchess of Thornbury's garden party, and Cecily attended because Lady Brixton required a companion, and because refusing would have cost more than the particular humiliation of arriving in the same pale muslin, repressed, with a shawl borrowed from Lady Brixton's maid that smelled faintly of camphor. The garden was green and vast and full of people who belonged there, and Cecily stood near the refreshment table with a glass of lemonade she did not drink and watched the season perform itself. Georgiana Palliser arrived on the arm of Lord Denham's eldest son, her gown a pale blue silk that caught the sunlight like water. She moved through the garden party the way a ship moves through a harbor it owns, and the crowd arranged itself around her with the easy deference that beauty and fortune have always commanded. She paused near the rose arbor, where 3 young women stood in a cluster, and said something that made them laugh. Cecily heard only the last of it. "Oh, the girl in the worn gown," Georgiana said, and she did not trouble to lower her voice. "She does rather haunt these things, does she not? Like a moth that cannot find the window." The 3 young women laughed again, shorter this time, because two of them had the grace to recognize cruelty when it was served with a smile. Cecily's hand tightened on her glass. The lemonade trembled at the rim. She set the glass down on the table beside her and pressed her palm flat against her skirt and stood very still and let the heat move through her face and neck and settle, the way a flame settles when there is nothing left to burn. Across the garden, the Duke of Halford stood beneath the old oak with a group of men whose conversation he was not following. He had watched Georgiana deliver her remark. He had watched Cecily receive it. He had watched the glass tremble in her hand, and the careful flatness with which she set it down. And something in his chest, the locked place, the place where the pressed violet lived, shifted like a door tested from the inside. He crossed the garden. He did not appear to hurry. He arrived at the refreshment table as though he had always been walking in that direction, and he stood beside Cecily Wren and said, without looking at her, "The lemonade is poor. Walk with me." It was not an invitation. It was a command, issued in the same level voice he used for everything. And Cecily heard only the command. She did not hear the protection inside it. She did not hear the fact that a duke had just crossed a crowded garden to stand beside the least important person in it, and that every eye in the party had followed him, and that Georgiana Palliser's smile had gone very still. "I am perfectly well, Your Grace," Cecily said, and her voice did not waver. "Walk with me," he said again. And this time he offered his arm. She took it. Her fingers rested on the dark fabric of his sleeve, and the warmth of his arm beneath the wool was so immediate and so startling that she drew a breath she could not explain and held it. They walked along the gravel path toward the far end of the garden, past the rose arbor, past the cluster of young women whose laughter had died, past Georgiana Palliser, who watched them go with an expression that had lost its polish. If this moment matters to you, if the image of a girl in a worn gown walking on the arm of the highest-ranking man in the garden has settled somewhere inside your chest, then perhaps you will stay a little longer. There is more to see. They walked in silence for a full minute. Then the Duke said, still not looking at her, "You draw." Cecily's step faltered. "Your Grace?" "In the garden. Last Tuesday. Violets." He paused. Each sentence was its own complete fact. "You draw very well." "My father taught me," she said, and then stopped, because her father was a subject she did not discuss with strangers, and the Duke of Halford was the most thorough stranger she had ever met. "Your father was a naturalist." She looked at him then, properly, for the first time. His face was turned slightly away from her, his jaw set in the way she was beginning to recognize as his particular armor, and his eyes, which the Tun called cold, were the color of smoke above a winter fire. "He was," she said carefully. "The precision of the sketch," he said. "The petal structure. It was observed, not copied." He paused again, and his voice dropped to a register that she felt in her ribs. "That kind of seeing is uncommon." They reached the end of the garden path. He released her arm and stepped back and looked at her for 2 full seconds. And then he said, "Eat something before you leave. The sandwiches are better than the lemonade." He turned and walked away. Cecily stood alone at the end of the gravel path, with her hand still lifted where his arm had been. Her fingers were trembling. She could not have said why. What she did not know was that the Duke of Halford had gone home that afternoon and taken the pressed violet from his waistcoat pocket and held it to the window light and looked at it for a long time. Eleanor had been dead for 7 years. The violet she had pressed was brown and fragile and nearly translucent, and the color it had kept was not the deep purple of the living flower, which was not the point. The point was that Eleanor had seen it. She had looked at a common wildflower and seen something worth preserving, and she had died before she could preserve anything else, and for 7 years the only evidence of her particular way of seeing had been a pressed violet in a waistcoat pocket, growing lighter and more fragile with each passing season. And then a woman on a bench in a public garden had drawn the same flower with the same quality of attention, and the Duke of Halford, who had not permitted himself to feel anything that could not be controlled since the winter of Eleanor's death, had felt the lock on the door in his chest give way by a quarter turn. He did not sit down. He stood at the window with the violet in his hand and pressed his other fist against the glass until his knuckles were white, and he remained there until the light failed, and the room went dark around him. Lady Ashworth had plans, and those plans did not include Cecily Wren. They included Georgiana Palliser, whose fortune was £30,000 and whose family connections reached into every drawing room that mattered, and they included a formal announcement at the Halford Ball in 10 days' time, and they included the quiet removal of every obstacle between her son and the future she had designed for him. The Dowager called upon Lady Brixton on a Tuesday afternoon. She arrived in a carriage with the Halford crest, wearing garnets and an expression of charitable concern, and she sat in Lady Brixton's parlor and drank tea she did not enjoy, and delivered her message with the surgical courtesy of a woman who had never been refused. Your niece is a credit to your generosity, Lady Brixton. One does admire the effort you have made on her behalf. She set her cup down, the porcelain clicking softly against the saucer. It occurs to me, however, that the season may not be quite the right setting for a girl in her position. The social demands, the expense of dressing properly, the strain of appearing where one is not quite expected. It can be unkind, can it not? To place a young woman where she cannot help but be measured against what she lacks. Lady Brixton, who had been thinking precisely the same thing for 3 months, nodded slowly. I have spoken with Mrs. Garfield in Lincolnshire, Lady Ashworth continued. She is looking for a companion. The position is respectable. Quiet. Miss Wren would be very comfortable there, I think. Away from all this. She gestured at the window, which showed nothing except the house across the street, and meant everything by it. Cecily was not in the room. She was upstairs, at her desk, sharpening a pencil with her father's small knife. She did not hear the conversation. She learned of it that evening, when Lady Brixton told her over dinner, in the same tone she used to announce the cost of candles, that arrangements were being made, that a position had been found, that it was best, really, for everyone. Cecily set her fork down. The metal clicked against the plate, a small sound in a room already full of small sounds. When? After the Halford Ball. Lady Ashworth was most specific about the timing. Lady Brixton folded her napkin. It is a kindness, Cecily. You must see that. Cecily saw it. She saw the mechanics of it with perfect clarity, the way a woman sees a trap after she has walked into it. The Dowager Duchess of Halford had noticed her son's arm offered at the garden party, and the Dowager Duchess of Halford had acted. Not with cruelty, precisely. With efficiency. She went upstairs. She sat at the narrow desk and opened her leather case and looked at the pencils and the paper and the small knife and the worn eraser. And she pressed her hands flat against the desk on either side of the case and held very still and did not weep. The light from the single candle threw her shadow long against the wall, and the shadow was steady, and after a while her breathing was steady, and after a while she picked up a pencil and began to draw. Not violets this time. The view from the window, the mews, the rooftops, the sky above the city that was about to send her away. 2 days before the Halford Ball, Cecily walked to the garden in the square for the last time. The bench was empty. The violets were still blooming, paler now as the season turned, and she sat and opened her case and began to sketch them with the slow, deliberate care of someone saying a private farewell. The pencil moved, the petals appeared, and when the gate opened and the Duke of Halford came through it, she did not stand, and she did not close her case, and she did not leave, because in 2 days she would be gone, and the rules of avoidance she had maintained since the garden party no longer seemed to apply. He stopped on the path. He looked at her. She looked at the violets. "You should not be out here alone," he said. "It is nearly dark. I am drawing. I can see that." He came closer. He stood at the end of the bench and looked at the sketch on her knee. And his face, the face that did not change, changed. The line of his jaw softened. The set of his mouth eased into something that was not quite a smile, and was not quite grief, and was entirely unguarded. "Come inside," he said. "There is better light in the house." Cecily looked up at him. In the fading afternoon, the smoke-colored eyes were darker than she remembered, and the particular quality of his attention, the way he looked at her sketch as though it contained something he had been searching for, made her pulse move in a way that frightened her. Not the fear of danger, the fear of wanting. "I am leaving after the ball, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Your mother has arranged a position for me in Lincolnshire, a companion post. It is best, I am told, for everyone." She watched his face. The softness vanished. The jaw locked. The hands at his sides went still, not the stillness of rest, the stillness of a man preventing himself from doing something with great and immediate force. "Who told you this?" he said. And his voice had dropped to a register she had not heard before, low and level, and carrying a vibration like a struck bell. "Lady Brixton. Lady Ashworth arranged it." He said nothing for a long time. The garden was quiet. The light was nearly gone. Then he said, "Finish your sketch," and turned and walked away. And the gate closed behind him with a sound like a sentence coming to an end. That night, at a supper at the Barrington house, a footman named Gerald remarked to the kitchen maid that the girl in the worn gown, the one the Duchess had taken such pains to place, would be gone within the week. "Packed off to Lincolnshire," he said, polishing a serving tray with a cloth. "Lady Ashworth does not leave these things to chance, not when there is a Palliser waiting in the wings." The kitchen maid said nothing, and Gerald did not know that Mrs. Ames, the old housekeeper from Halford, who had come to the Barrington supper to oversee the borrowed silver, was standing in the corridor and heard every word. Mrs. Ames had been at Halford for 30 years. She had known Eleanor Ashworth from the day she was born until the day she was buried, and she had watched the Duke seal himself inside his grief the way a man seals a letter he never intends to send. She had seen the pressed violet in his pocket year after year. She had seen the way his hand went to it in quiet moments, a gesture so habitual it had become invisible. And she had heard from the garden staff that the Duke had recently been seen standing at a bench in the square garden watching a young woman draw. Mrs. Ames said nothing that evening. She did not need to. She went home to the Halford house and waited. The Halford ball arrived on a Friday evening in late May, and the house was lit with 500 candles and dressed with white roses and the silver that had been in the family for 4 generations. Cecily attended because Lady Brixton had insisted, because a final appearance was owed to the season that had tolerated her, and because the pale muslin gown, repressed a 3rd time with particular care by Lady Brixton's maid, who had shown this one small kindness without being asked, would hold for one more evening. She entered the ballroom knowing it was the last time she would enter any ballroom, and the knowledge gave her a strange and terrible clarity. The room was golden. The music was bright. Georgiana Palliser stood at the center of it in ivory silk, her throat circled with the Palliser emeralds, her smile as composed and certain as a clock. Lady Ashworth stood beside her, radiant with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose plans have been executed without complication. The announcement, Cecily understood, was expected tonight. The Duke would offer for Georgiana. The season would approve, and Cecily Wren, the girl in the worn gown, would leave for Lincolnshire in the morning, and the room would close behind her, like water over a dropped stone. She stood near the eastern wall, where the acoustics carried and the candlelight was thinnest, and she held her hands at her sides, and she did not look for the Duke of Halford, because looking would have cost something she could not afford to spend. The dancing was underway when Lady Ashworth stepped forward. The music paused. The room turned, and the Dowager began to speak, her voice carrying across the ballroom with the clear authority of a woman who had never doubted her right to shape a room. Friends, it gives me great pleasure to share with you this evening an announcement that has brought our family immense joy. My son, the Duke of Halford, and Miss Georgiana Palliser have reached an understanding, and I am honored to share with you all that they are to be married before the end of the season. The room stirred. Georgiana's smile widened. The crowd began to murmur with the warm, collective sound of an expectation confirmed. And then the Duke of Halford stepped forward from the far side of the ballroom, and the room went quiet, because his face was not the face of a man confirming a happy announcement. It was the face of a man who had made a decision that would cost him everything his mother had built, and who was making it anyway, and who was making it now. He did not look at Georgiana. He did not look at his mother. He walked across the ballroom floor, past the dancers, past the musicians, past the 500 candles and the white roses and the silver, and he stopped in front of Cecily Wren, who stood near the eastern wall in her twice-turned muslin with her hands at her sides and her face very pale, and her eyes wide with a confusion that had not yet become understanding. The room held its breath. He looked at her. She looked at him. The smoke-colored eyes were not cold. They were not guarded. They were open. Fully open. And what she saw inside them was the thing she had seen on his face in the garden, when he looked at her sketch. The thing that was not quite a smile, and not quite grief, and was entirely unguarded. And she understood, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, what he was about to do. Miss Cecily Wren is to be the next Duchess of Halford, he said. His voice was level. His voice carried to every corner of the room. He did not raise it. He did not need to. Lady Ashworth's hand went to the column beside her. Her fingers gripped the marble, and her face, which had been the picture of composed authority, lost its architecture. Her mouth opened. No sound came. She looked at her son. And for the first time in Cecily's memory, the Dowager Duchess of Halford did not have the next sentence prepared. Georgiana Palliser's smile held for 2 more seconds, the way a candle holds its flame in a sudden draught, and then it went out. She lowered her eyes. She folded her gloved hands at her waist, and she turned, slowly, and walked toward the doorway with a composure that was its own kind of defeat. The crowd did not cheer. The crowd did something quieter and more devastating. It rearranged itself. Faces turned toward Cecily with the careful recalibration of people who had just been shown that they had been looking at the wrong woman for the entire season. And somewhere in the middle of the room, a woman whose name Cecily did not know, a woman in a dark gown with kind eyes, nodded once, as though she had been waiting for exactly this. Cecily's hands were shaking. Her breath had gone. The room had not moved, and the room had changed entirely. And the Duke of Halford was standing in front of her with his arm extended, offering it the way he had offered it at the garden party, The same gesture, the same level voice, except that this time the entire world was watching, and this time the gesture was not deniable, and this time his eyes were open, and she could see what lived behind the door. He had kept locked for 7 years. She took his arm. His hand covered hers. His palm was warm and steady against her trembling fingers, and he walked her forward, past the eastern wall, past the column where his mother leaned, past the doorway where Georgiana had disappeared, and into the center of the room that had decided, finally, to see her. Mrs. Ames stood in the corridor outside the ballroom, just past the service door, with her hands folded over her apron. She had not been invited to the ball. She had not needed to be. She watched through the open doorway as the Duke led the girl in the worn gown to the center of the floor, and her eyes, which had been dry for 7 years, were not dry now. She had seen Eleanor in the garden, pressing violets. She had seen Henry at the window, pressing his fist to the glass. And she had seen, tonight, the door open. Later, much later, after the candles had burned low and the guests had gone and the white roses had begun to drop their petals on the polished floor, Cecily sat in the library at Halford House. A fire burned in the grate. The room smelled of old leather and beeswax, and the particular warm stillness of a house that has decided to be kind. The Duke sat across from her, in a chair he had pulled closer to the fire than was strictly necessary, and between them, on the small table where a glass of claret sat untouched, lay 2 things. The first was Cecily's sketch of the violets from the garden bench, the one she had taken back from the bench that first afternoon, the one she had drawn with her father's pencils on her father's paper with her father's patience. It was smoothed flat. It was perfect. The second was a pressed violet, brown and nearly translucent and 7 years old, resting on the page beside the drawn ones as though it had always been there. Cecily looked at the sketch and the pressed flower and the firelight moving across both of them, and she looked at the man who had carried a dead girl's violet in his pocket for 7 years, and who had seen, in a stranger's pencil strokes on a park bench, the same quality of attention that he had loved in his sister and lost and never expected to find again. "Henry," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He looked up. His face, in the firelight, was not the face the season knew. It was open and quiet, and very tired and very young, and the smoke-colored eyes held the particular expression of a man who has walked a long distance to arrive at a place he was not certain existed. "I would like to draw this room," she said. He did not smile. He did something smaller and more significant. He leaned forward and moved the pressed violet a 1/4 inch closer to the drawn ones, so that the real and the rendered lay side by side in the circle of firelight, and he said, "Draw whatever you like. You are home." Outside the library window, the May night had turned cool, and the last of the candles in the ballroom had gone dark, and the square garden where a girl had once sat on a bench and drawn violets she did not know would change her life was quiet, under a sky that was not quite black and not quite blue and held, in the space between the stars, the particular color of a violet that keeps its hue even after it has been pressed. Thank you for staying until the end of this one. If Cecily's journey found a place in you, take a moment to share which moment stayed, and come back soon. There are more stories waiting.